From I Am Interchange, it's the Hatch Podcast series. Okay, think about the last tomato you ate. Not a good one, a regular one. Grocery store, middle of winter, pale on the inside, kind of mealy. Doesn't really taste like anything. That tomato traveled further than most people go on vacation. Picked green, somewhere warm, weeks before you saw it. Put in a room and gassed with ethylene so it would turn red on schedule. Because red is what we reach for. And it was bred over decades, deliberately. Not to taste good, but to survive the truck. And that part got to me. When I first started paying attention to this stuff, is that nobody chose that. There's no villain. It's just what you get when the whole system is built to move food cheap and far. And the person actually growing it has the least say of anyone in the chain. I'm Tate Chamberlin, and that's the world I wanted to spend some time in. So I sat down with 4 people who have each, in their own way, made food their life's work. Katie Stebbins, Tim West, Paola DealMeida, and Sanah Baig. They get into the stuff you'd expect. How you even fall into food activism in the first place. For most of them, it started small. Learning to cook, getting curious about where the thing on the plate actually comes from, food safety, the tomato supply chain, which is somehow more insane the closer you look. Why a small farmer basically cannot win against processing and subsidies, no matter how good they are at farming. But the part I keep thinking about came later, when the conversation turned to the Farm Bill. Because most people hear Farm Bill and picture, corn, tractors. It's not that. It's school lunches. It's SNAP. It's the thing quietly deciding whether a kid eats. One of them makes the case that we've been calling it the wrong name this whole time. That it's really a community bill, and we should start treating it like one. So that's today. How food got personal for these 4, and what it would actually take to keep the local stuff alive. Pull up a chair. As you evolved as a human, is there a moment you can remember that food became your life mission?
For me, I've always been very concerned about the 5 fundamentals of human dignity that I like to call water, food, health, shelter, and education. At one point in my career, I had the opportunity to work for one of the largest food manufacturers in the world. Stepping into that world without having any background of how food systems worked, I felt it was a privilege to be able to have that learning firsthand. Ultimately, I just fell in love with the complexity of food systems. A lot of people talk about complexity is so challenging and we need to simplify everything. And I actually think that's precisely the beauty of food systems. It's foundational, touching so many people around the world so many times a day, because hopefully everybody's eating 3 meals a day. Doesn't always happen in certain parts of the world. And so just ensuring that fundamental right to humans just made me fall in love with the space, the industry, the possibilities of what we needed to do given the challenges at hand.
I can jump in on that. The complexity piece is what drew me in. I had an internship when I was in college at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I grew up in the D.C. area. My dad was a Fed. He worked for the EPA for more than 40 years. I understood the power of public service, the impact, and the mission drive. I had, by accident, got this internship at USDA, their ARS headquarters, Ag Research Service out in Beltsville, Maryland. I went out there, had no idea what to expect. And I was surrounded by scientists that were innovating, driving forward critical science to ensure that the food that we had on our table was safe, delicious, nutritious, and make sure that all of these innovations were getting to farmers so that our food could stay affordable as well. It was such a complex and dynamic system. And then I realized we're giving out grants and we have collaborations with international scientists. I never really thought about food in the global element. I thought about when I traveled to my mom's country and that type of thing. But when I realized that the science and innovation behind it was intense and important, and we weren't trying to solve challenges of today, we were trying to be 3-4 steps ahead of the game, that really drew me in. And then I started becoming a student, food systems, and had always been driven by this question of if we have our dietary guidelines, at that point, I think still the food pyramid, and we know what we should be eating, why is it so hard for people to eat that? Why are those not the default choices in the store? Why are we supporting things that are not actually what the other part of our department at USDA says we should be eating? And that is a question I still have I'm still exploring to this day.
Questions.
So my experience was more linear. I was working as an environmental planner, and I had to do water quality work and a stormwater program. We had to measure water quality for stormwaters. And we had 13 lakes and ponds in the city I worked in. It's a super low income city. And I formed these lakes associations. We associate a lake association with a wealthy community that lives on a lake, but these were polluted ponds in people's backyards. So we got canoes and Secchi discs, and we got this EPA grant, and it was a competitive grant at the time. We got one of 7 in the country to do fish tissue sampling. And the fish tissue turned up very highly contaminated for PCBs and mercury. And it was this moment of watching that I'm in a living room and we're sharing these lab results, and the looks on people's faces, because this was their primary protein source. In my environmental journey as an environmentalist and as a toxic waste activist, it was the first time I saw it in the food system. And I went, whoa, this was in a different level. I'm in economic development, and people would say, oh, those people in those neighborhoods don't want to work. No, they just want to be on SSI forever. No, sick neighborhoods don't work, literally and figuratively. These are people who we were contaminating. We produced signs in 4 different languages with the EPA money that would have gone up next to all the lakes and ponds and told everybody about the hazards of eating the fish in the pond. The municipality at the time refused to put them up, and they never got installed. Wow. Heartbreaking. And the fight goes on.
Wow.
East side of the tracks, wrong side of the tracks.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yikes. Yeah, I had these 2 food epiphanies, one when I was 16 and one of my first jobs, and the second a couple of years later in college as a freshman. And the first one was I'd been working in this California-style cafe in the suburbs of New York. I called the Flying Pig. And there was a farm nearby, Cabbage Hill Farm, that would come and do a farmer's market. And my twin brother and I are cooking there. I was sweeping and mopping floors. He was a prep cook. And there's this moment in between when the farmer's market ended and before dinner service began, we would have a family meal. I found myself one day sitting between the farmers that had grown my food and the chefs that had prepared it. And then we got up and everybody's cleaning up and they're blasting Highway to Hell from AC/DC, and the chef is dancing with the prep cooks. And I'm thinking to myself, oh man, these people are cool. I want to be cool someday. But that was my twin brother's gig. He was going on his path to culinary school at CIA. And so I went off to CU Boulder. It was one day when I had gotten food poisoning from Taco Bell. And after 3 days of crawling back and forth from my bed to the bathroom, I thought to myself, I got to learn to cook. I don't want this to happen again. How is it? I have no idea where my food comes from and how to cook it. My brother was in culinary school, and I called him and I said, hey, Chris, how do you cook chicken? I've got this chicken. He says, it's simple. You get a pan hot, you put some oil in, salt and pepper on a chicken, and you have chicken. I managed to cook this chicken, sit down and eat it, and there's a knock on my door. It's my stoned friends from down the hall, like, hey, what you doing? It smells good. You want to share? Here's a joint. And all of a sudden, I'm sitting around
It's so bold.
eating chicken with these guys, and I'm thinking to myself, like, if I learn to cook, A, I'll be healthier. B, I'll make more friends. And C, it's a skill I can travel with. I really didn't know what I wanted to do, but I had enough experience traveling on foreign exchange that I thought it was a great form of education. I could just take the skill and go around the world. So that's when I decided to join my brother at culinary school, and that's how it began.
All 3 of you have talked already so far in this conversation about how food safety has impacted all of you somehow. Mm-hmm. Talked about your dad already working and the exposure in DC to that. You talked about contaminated fish. You talked about struggling with Taco Bell. That was a bad idea.
Live and learn.
But we talk about complexity of food systems, but food safety is such a starting point. I once had a mentor tell me, and that stuck with me, and I like to repeat it, that if it's not safe, it's not food.
Yeah.
And I think we look at food produced around the world, significant amount of food in systems that we can debate whether they are nutritionally equitable or not, but they're efficient at scale. Maybe not targeted and fit for context, but there's a lot that's wasted.
It's interesting as you're talking about that. We often talk about nutrition security and we talk about health-related things and we talk about ultra-processed foods being the bad guy, but at the same time, we put shelf stability on the sideline. And we have to be honest about how important it is to have shelf-stable food for people who need it when they need it.
And I just want to remind folks that oftentimes food safety is the topic that folks assume is a given in the system.
Yep.
And that in many parts of the world, that's not necessarily the case because there's missing dry, cold storage facilities, processing facilities. There's a lot of people around the world that are eating contaminated food with mycotoxins, which is a leading cause of stunting. So a lot of human capital erosion. So I just wanted to point out that you've all had your own encounters and experiences with food safety. And I think it's a foundational topic in food that doesn't get the right airtime. So there, I just put a plug in for food safety.
Shout out to our food safety inspection service and inspectors all over the country and the world. And actually, when I was at the USD interning there was a huge tomato recall. And that re-emphasized the importance of this work. You're totally right. I remember that being a moment of, wow, this is significant. And also the science that got activated to figure out how do we prevent this from happening again? How do we ensure that farmers have all the tools that they need to have good handling practices? Critically important point.
Sorry, I'm just going to jump in again because Sanah brings up another important point. We think we know everything about our supply chains, but we don't. This recall illustrates how far we've come and how much data we've generated, but yet there's still so much more to be known, right? So this concept of traceability, knowing precisely once an issue hits in the supply chain, where is the source? There are many parts of the world, including the United States, that today it still takes a long time to pinpoint and stop that issue.
Can I ask, I want to push on that a little bit because radical transparency of the food supply chain, especially in the US, is something that comes up a lot in the conversations I have at Tufts and with food activists, nonprofits. My understanding is we have the technology. I've never worked inside food. I've only been someone on the outside judging from the sidelines, right? And eating. I always say to people, I'm not a food expert or a nutritionist. I'm an eater. And that's what I know about food. I'm curious about that, Paola. Why don't we have that? And why in a day and age when everybody wants transparency about everything, there's still so much cloak and dagger secrecy around our food supply chain?
Yeah. I'm not so sure that it's cloak and dagger secrecy. For some parts, some supply chains, perhaps that's the thought. But I think what most folks don't appreciate is that there's a value chain of procurement. Depending on what raw material you're talking about, that raw material can change hands 30 times across the world. And that means for you to get this, you're absolutely right, Katie, that we have the tools today. We have a lot of tools. We have surveillance mechanisms. We have databases. We have AI that can do some predictive risk modeling. But all of the players across that value chain of procurement, all the way down to the farm, which in some places of this planet are very remote and don't even have basic infrastructure like electricity and connection to road infrastructure and systems. It's very difficult for you to actually get them to adopt some of these tools and technologies.
So the tomato supply chains in the United States, a large amount of tomatoes come from Immokalee, Florida, right? And if we're talking about safety, we're not just talking about the fact that the food is safe to eat. We're talking about the conditions the workers are growing in are actually safe. And the Coalition of Immokalee Workers was created by the workers because there were cases of modern day slavery happening in our fields. Why is that happening? For profit at all costs. Costs are being externalized onto society and the environment. You think those waterways are safe for drinking down there? That could be the contaminated conditions where these people are not being treated, which contaminates the water, that contaminates the tomatoes. So it's also really important to examine safety in the context of the environment.
100%.
And then in how we design our business models.
100%.
Yeah, and you talk about coming to a fully mature, developed food and ag system like the U.S., there's still all of this technology and this capability that's cost to models, especially when you get to the farm level, that are strapped, right? You look at dairy farmers in the United States, they are struggling. They don't make money, and all they see is requirements to help them participate in the markets. And that's adding on to that model.
Small dairy farmers, right? And we know that there's a huge burden on them, and there's been a huge loss of our small dairies in this country as a result of consolidation. And part of it is right. They can't meet those thresholds. They can't compete with the larger guys.
Is that the role for government?
There's a huge effort right now to try to combat our consolidated system. I think the Secretary of Agriculture is finally talking about it. The president himself issued executive orders to specifically combat consolidation, looking at food being one of the most consolidated sectors that we have in our economy, and especially looking at meat and dairy, because the small farmers can't compete. They really can't, and they don't have the processing. They can't get priority in processing to take their dairy cows or take their farm animals.
So you're probably better than any of us here to speak to some of the subsidy disparity between large-scale commodity crops and what is classified as specialty crops. If 80% of our diet is supposed to be fruits and vegetables, then why are we only subsidizing X 1, 2, 3% of our food system in fruits and vegetables? Because they're technically classified as specialty crops?
What is a specialty crop, right? It is a fruit, vegetable, nut. It's all the main stuff on your plate.
And it's the produce aisle. That's what surprised me is a specialty crop is cucumbers and peppers.
Why do we call it that? Language matters, right?
Isn't that just a crop?
Your question is a great one. And I would say for folks curious, go and talk to your senators and your members, because they write the Farm Bill and they determine where all the money to USDA, what we're supposed to do with it. They give us the authorities, they give us the money, and then we implement. And within the law, we create programs that we think are going to be maximally beneficial. And it depends on the values driving us and how we create those programs. So conversations around the Farm Bill right now are critically important. Just yesterday, Senator Stabenow released the framework for this Farm Bill, which has been in the works for far too long. These are conversations where regular people, even if you're not in food, must go and put their voice to the conversation and say, why is this happening this way? Why is it more expensive for me to buy broccoli for my family than it is to buy ground beef? Why does my family have to make these hard choices? When we know, when you're telling us too that, hey, here's my plate and three-fourths of it should look this way, I can't afford it. There is a very complicated
system. It's dubbed a specialty. It makes it sound like it's not a norm, right?
There have been a couple of hearings where senators have brought this up. I can't remember which one. And they're like, yeah, even the fact that we call it specialty crops. I'm like, sir, you have the power to change that. We can't necessarily change that, but there is more of a recognition now of why this is happening. But subsidies is such a complicated term. I think when we wrap it up in that term, we forget about crop insurance. We forget about research, which I think is a form of subsidy as well. My mission area has a $4 billion research portfolio. People can take a look and see where that funding is going. Increasingly, we're prioritizing a focus on crops, on small, local, organic, regenerative, and also food innovation. Thinking about equity, not just in terms of how are workers treated, how are we supporting our BIPOC communities, but thinking about equity in terms of what are the types of crops that we've dedicated our research dollars to? Where have we focused? Is this equitable? Is our research portfolio equitable in terms of, are we bringing in new ideas, or are we making sure that we're focusing on areas that haven't gotten as much attention as commodity crops, which are critically important, but they have gotten the lines.
And commodity crops have great infrastructure, right?
Absolutely.
Why do we not have more fruits and vegetables available? We need better regional infrastructure for food systems for processing those fruits and vegetables so we can make them shelf stable, so we can send them around and get in more people's hands.
And we were able to get a couple $2 billion from the American Rescue Plan to do exactly that. But it takes time to see the benefit of that. And a huge push during COVID, and Congress passed the American Rescue Plan, bipartisan infrastructure law, Inflation Reduction Act, 3 major pieces of legislation driven by the president's agenda to really say, how do we combat consolidation? How do we support local regional food systems? And especially that processing piece is so key. So we're in the process right now of getting these grants out the door, creating that infrastructure. The administration's really started with meat, because meat and dairy and supporting local livestock producers. There has been a huge effort. I can't remember how many billions of dollars, but now they're focusing on, quote, non-meat and making sure we're building out the rest of that infrastructure. But it's new, it's early. We're trying really quickly to get the money out the door, but why is it happening now in 2024 is part of my question too.
In 2024, I'd ask 2 things. First of all, I think calling it the Farm Bill is crazy, because there's so much, people don't realize how much is in the quote Farm Bill that is not farm related. We're talking about school lunches and SNAP and WIC and all this stuff.
The biggest part of the Farm Bill, right? Is our nutrition bill.
It should really be called programs. Like the community food bill or something, right? But we read it because people don't engage with it because they're like, I'm not a farmer. And I'm like, oh, the Farm Bill is way bigger than farms. That's the first thing. The second thing is you're talking about critical infrastructure. In my world as a city planner, you think about critical infrastructure as roads and bridges, or in cybersecurity, I thought about critical infrastructure and how we protect that stuff. What we don't have is we're adding critical infrastructure in that same genre around food. You can roll out a map of the United States, see all the roads and bridges in this country. We have it documented, laid out, and we know where they need to go, and we have a capital improvement plan around them. And on food, we need to have the same, roll out the map and look at the critical infrastructure map of food. And we don't have an infrastructure map of food in this country. And I think if we had one, it would allow us to navigate and prioritize, and as a community say, look, there's a road here that's missing. Look, this bridge is falling apart. And I think we need to elevate the food infrastructure to the roads and bridges and what we consider the infrastructure of the country. Infrastructure.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to build upon that and also highlight that, for instance, the Tyson Foods factory a few years ago was hacked. There was a cyber attack. So if we have large-scale centralized food systems, they're vulnerable. 100%. If we have decentralized regional food systems, then we have a much more resilient food infrastructure, especially if you do it around watersheds.
Yeah, there's a whole world of cyber and food. Very interesting.
30% offline with just that one.
I want to make a point around this, Katie, to underscore the importance of this map of infrastructure, because now being on the investment side, there's a lot of capital out there that wants to be deployed to food, to infrastructure of food. And I'm not talking about small ticket sizes. I'm talking about very large ticket sizes. And they're rightly asking very important questions to say, I'm happy to consider the investment, but what is that going towards? How do I know it's meaningful in the system? A positive domino effect of change. And will it be sustainable in the long term? And not in the sense of sustainability, but will it be something that will carry on and maintain itself into the future? Because I think you've alluded to some of the innovation of the technology in the past. Some of it has been very allegoric in terms of how it's come out of the gates from an investment standpoint. It has not lived up to its promises. And so investors obviously are a bit shy for some of these investments. And I have heard some folks go as far as to say investing in food is the fastest way to lose money. I actually laugh about that because you have 8 billion people on this planet that hopefully have to eat 3 times a day. I think about that as an annuity. Right? It may not be setting the world on fire in terms of returns. One could debate whether it should. I think it's a portfolio of returns across the value chain from 100%. Farm to fork.
Yep.
I think you can make money. You can make solid money in food. You have a select few companies, which you're talking about with consolidation, that are making a lot of money in food. But the question is, let's help that money be mobilized for the right investments. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because you talked about this map of the infrastructure. I think this would be, Sanah, really helpful. And I know
wink, nudge, nudge.
Yeah, this would be really helpful if the U.S. government could help. And I know the U.S. government's doing that, not just here through the USDA, but also in other agencies. I know USAID has a lot of efforts in trying to create foundational rights in many other parts of the world, like investments in ancient grains. There was a beautiful article that just came out recently about the work that they're doing in Africa about that. Let's just think about how do we make that map a little bit more visible so folks can say, okay, it makes sense on the basis of the maturity of this region, as you say, or this country, their food system and ag system, to maybe we invest in cold and dry storage facility here. Over here, we're going to invest in precision irrigation, robotics, collection of strawberries on the field.
We have to create the map. I mean, it doesn't exist. The information exists, but we haven't put pen and paper and actually put it down because it's still a black box of information. Yeah. And if you're in the know, if you're not in the know, you don't know. Let's do this. Yeah. Like, hey, Tufts University, USDA, let's go build this map. Please. As someone who was in city planning and economic development for so long, this is an economic development strategy. Because if I'm an economic developer and I'm a regional economist, and so if I'm building my regional economic land use map, my land use map generally doesn't include a food infrastructure. I know from being a city planner for 20 years, that was not in my dashboard. I didn't put that in my metrics. That's not something I delivered to the mayor. We need to normalize I would love it if 20 years from now, we have normalized this. There are GIS layers, because right now there's not a GIS layer at a city hall that has food on a layer, right? Or food infrastructure on a layer as an economic development framework. And we have MapQuest. I can look for a restaurant. Do we use MapQuest anymore? I don't know. Maybe we don't. I just totally dated myself.
Okay, Google Maps.
Google Maps. Okay. We can go to Google Maps. But I'm like, look, we can find a restaurant, but I can look at the entire national network of restaurants.
So you're building a beautiful case. And I hope that my economists at ERS are listening to this, because I think that they would be excited to share what they've done. We have a food access research atlas, I think FARA. There's a database. We can go and take a look, map out our food deserts, right? They don't call it that. They're mapping food security and access. And you can see where is the pantry, where are some of the feeding operations kitchens. It's not comprehensive, but there's a start, and that's publicly available. Now, I think about rural development. And when we talk about this infrastructure that is so critical as we're scaling and creating food that is different than maybe we have done it in the past, this begs an existential question for USDA, which I think we've been struggling with in the food innovation world, which is you are the Department of Agriculture, and agriculture means so many different things, but it's historically not really focused on past the farm gate in the same way, right? Like now there is so much more need for that processing element in a way that we haven't really seen it before. And honestly, I don't think the USDA has been equipped to meet that demand. So we have the private sector stepping in and say, we will fund this infrastructure. There's a lot of risk involved there, especially with new technologies, new innovations. And people are coming to us, especially in the bioeconomy, looking at alternative proteins fermentation. They're like, hey, fund this. This is food. It's providing food security. This is a great solution. It's complementary proteins, complementary food sources that we can ship around the world. And we're like, we don't really do that at scale. That's not really our job. Like we can support certain things, but that is the key gap. And it's been unearthed by conversations around the bioeconomy. And the number one conversation from food innovators is where do we go to get that support? And I will say a shout out to rural development. They do have programs, or business and industry program through some of our other programs, but they're hard to get a loan guarantee, to get that funding. And there's restrictions. You have to be in a rural area in certain cases. We have a couple of case studies in which we've been able to help finance fermentation facilities, but it is a major gap. And I think it calls attention to the fact that we were not really built this way. And so I think we need a whole new kind of way of thinking about this. Because of the money that came through the American Rescue Plan, Inflation Reduction Act, and others, we're building out this processing capacity. We've been putting money to the states and local governments to say, hey, build out this infrastructure. But you're right. Like the map in that way, I don't think exists. And I think that will enable us to better figure out where are the gaps that we need to keep funding, especially when we layer on the persistent poverty areas, when we layer on where will we be growing more crops, like looking at Memphis and the Delta and recognize there is a dearth of infrastructure there. So it will help us make future decisions more strategically and in partnership with the private sector, which I think is critical.
I think there's another benefit that will come from this. Katie, happy to get your perspective on this because this is what you've been facilitating at Tufts for some time now. But this map would also help these technologies and solutions, some more developed and others more emergent, to have a clear role in that map. Yes. For them to have a clear purpose and for folks to understand precisely where those interventions bolt on and what's required for them to operate at scale. Here's the key. There's a lot of great solutions. I think you mentioned this before around, don't we have solutions? Yes, we have. In the last 20 to 30 years, we've been prolific at creating very sophisticated solutions in the system. They just haven't been strung together, implemented as a complete intervention into the system. And I can understand why many have gotten enamored with these solutions because they have unlocked what historically has been thought of the impossible. But many of them are not ready to operate at scale. Some will never operate at scale. And that's okay. We need to talk about what is necessary for them to still remain relevant in the system. And it also needs to be balanced and calibrated in what role they fulfill in the system, because I see some folks, especially entrepreneurs, trying to get funding from many fronts and trying to create a long-term business viability, making promises into the system and claims about things that simply are not or never will be. But they still have a role in the overall toolkit of solutions that we need to feed humanity from now until the next at least 100 years. I also like to calibrate that some of the technologies that some folks in the public discourse like to poo-poo, like vertical farms, people are like, it's dead. And I'm like, really? You really think that vertical farms are dead? Maybe the business model today is not great, and you may not love how that business makes money today or doesn't. But
it doesn't mean it's not an important part of
and we're
food.
working out the kinks, and maybe it's not ready to make money now in the next 5 years and 10 years. And I realize that's not an answer that investors like to hear. And I appreciate that. But then it's the question of what's the finance runway stack that we need to line up to support these technologies so that they fit the right purpose.
What you're describing is someone who's in economic development is you're describing a use case. You're describing helping entrepreneurs develop a use case around an economic development need. And this ends up being a lock and key conversations between local government and entrepreneurs, which, by the way, doesn't exist very well. Civic tech is a really tough space, and it's hard to get government as customer. And so what I think is really beautiful about that notion is you end up building out that infrastructure together, and government could say, we have a need here. And the entrepreneurs could say, we're solving a need here. It might not be perfect, but that would create a new dialogue. It would also create a new dialogue for entrepreneurs at the local level. It would unlock a whole new world of food tech entrepreneurs that aren't currently empowered now. So you and I had to talk about this. Like, there's so few. We just convened Boston Food Tech across a different value food chain and tech companies and food in Boston. And there's only 2 founders of color in all of the 150 companies. And that's really troubling for me because the people on the ground who know what infrastructure is needed are not the ones given the agency and the power and the understanding of how to build a use case and get access to the capital stack and do this and then have that conversation with local government. I think you'd have more municipal and state funding going into this space if it was couched around this conversation of critical infrastructure and economic outcomes.
It's a perfect segue into our brand new regional food business centers that we've just funded across the country. They're brand new. I think more than 10 of them. You can look up which one is in your region, trying to do that matchmaking, viewing food and business development as economic development and recognizing that it is best locally led and regionally developed and deployed. And so having universities as partners as well to seed the innovation. And so I want to go back. We're talking about scaling. How do we actually empower entrepreneurs and how do we de-risk? And so the federal government's number one job is to de-risk and to make sure that we are taking on as much risk as possible and seeding innovation. Part of what we do is try to make sure some of the core technology that Beyond Meat uses to extrude that pea protein and make it into the format that they have came from USDA funded research at the University of Missouri. We do that research. We put it out there in the public domain. We want to spur thousands of companies like that. That is our entire goal. Nobody wants to do research for it to sit on a shelf, but we need to have that mechanism of matchmaking to be much stronger and to say, hey, our scientists developed this new method, and then tag team that with the regional food business centers and other entrepreneurs for them to say, oh, wow, this is really novel. Oh, okay. And how do we get it connected to all the processing capacity that I might need? And then the marketing components and then the food safety elements that can be tricky. And so we're building out that system, but it is really a new way of thinking, reaching out and saying, hey, food entrepreneurs, we need you and we'll help you and we'll support you and we'll give you the access to the science and the scaling.
Tim, what this brings up for me is this is a new form of democracy. And you're having conversations right now around what does democracy look like in this country? And I think there's a link here between owning our food, developing out an infrastructure for food, having a new modernized economic development conversation around food and democracy. This is how you show up. And none of us can show up if we don't have the access to what we need and the knowledge we need. And I'm interested in your thoughts on that because it feels so linked.
History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. People before us have had these same conversations. That was how the land-grant university system came to be, where each state was given 10,000 acres and the charter to ensure agricultural security in those states.
Started at the same time as the U.S. Department of Agriculture, right? Recognizing we needed innovation to grow our ag economy.
Now, if we can bridge these gaps between land grants and these new food business centers. But then again, I'm looking here on the shelf, and Omnivore's Dilemma on the shelf, and there was this case study that happened. I think it was University of Oregon. It was the land grant in Oregon where they banned the book, Omnivore's Dilemma. And all the students revolted. And why did they ban the book? Entrenched interests didn't want the students being taught all about our food system. So the question is, do we have democracy or do we have corporatocracy? It's when we have these entrenched interests shaping policy for their own advantage, when these land grants should be making decisions on the best interests of ensuring agriculture security for everyone.
100%.
So you look at University of Massachusetts, they have a land grant university.
Shared alma mater.
Exactly, another one.
But
what are they known for, Katie? They're known for turf management of golf courses. Is that a really good use of ensuring agricultural security? It's not.
No.
I think we really need to look at what those in the past have done, revitalize the infrastructure, fund it properly, and build it into these new business centers with real maps and understand what is the roadmap to getting back to. And I could go off on a long tribe. We need true cost accounting. We need to account for all these costs that are being externalized.
Which Rockefeller's been doubling down on, moving ahead on it, rebuild some pretty shit
Which
stuff.
is awesome. Now, the question is, why is our government not doing that? Rockefeller's doing it because our government is not meeting those needs.
To the land grant question, I was at the APLU meeting, the American Public Land Grant University conference, and we got the secretary to go, Secretary Vilsack, and he presented a new vision. You can look up his whiteboard speech. And part of it is based on the reality of we have a system set up since about the 70s, which has been optimized for yield. So grow as much as you can in tandem with the Green Revolution, all of these ways of thinking of how we're going to feed the world. It's about quantity over quality and not thinking about the externalities, impact on communities, on health. And now we're saying, hey, okay, we really need to completely transform the system in this way of thinking. And the urgency around it is the fact that 87% of farmers in the United States do not make their primary income from farming. 50% of farmers lose money in farming. You couple that against the fact that over the past couple of years, we've had record farm income in the United States. People are making money, but it's just a vast majority of farmers are not making money. So we have a system that has been set up to produce as much as possible, be ultra productive, continue to make sure that small and mid-sized farmers are going out of business, that the people who are in business are not making money. The work that he's been talking about is creating brand new income streams, leveraging local, regional, leveraging the bioeconomy, figuring out how to take advantage of the climate smart label and some of those practices. But it's new. And we're trying to help people wake up to the fact that this system is really not working for the overwhelming majority of people. I was with the land grant leaders and presidents and deans of agriculture all over the country. They were like, wow, he just presented our new strategic plan. I really hope that they follow up on that. I really hope they see the vision. But it's an odd thing, right? Because it's reinforced by the values of administrations that come in. That has been reinforced through our funding. So my mission area funds land grant, they were the primary funder for land grant universities and capacity programs. And we give them billions of dollars to have their capacity and their research and all of the work that they do. And they largely decide it based on what they think they should be doing based on this system that's been entrenched over the past many decades. It really is a turning point moment. And I do think that there are some that are really leading the charge. Let us not forget about our tribal land grant universities, our Black land grant universities. So our 1994s and our 1890s, they're called that because that was the year of the legislation that created them. And the work that we're doing, my team is doing, is funding as much as we can to support the capacity of those institutions, thinking about indigenous and traditional ecological knowledge. We don't really have a whole lot of research around that. So we're trying to fund more of that in 1984s and have partnerships to make sure that we're answering those questions. How do we support Black farmers and culturally appropriate crops and foods that they're used to eating and build scale and infrastructure around that? And then how do we help community members incorporate those foods into their diets? Because that is a whole other question, right? We have more than $500 million of nutrition research that we fund every year, and we're not actually helping people understand how to make those choices better. So the work that we're doing with land grants is kind of focusing on the land grants that have been left behind. And those are really our tribal, our Black land grants get a very small percentage of that funding that Congress appropriates to us to give to those universities. But I think they're a critical part of this equation.
Can I offer a thought for this group? I absolutely agree on the tipping point that we're at right now. I think this is a consideration for all of those who have been incumbents in food and ag systems that have been in that industry for a long time. I'm going to zoom it out to a global scale too, because this has been an active conversation at very senior levels in government, in many governments around the world, that food security is an issue, it is a concern, and it is now a priority. And when such a topic or any topic of that matter becomes that kind of attention on so many agendas at the same time, it is an active conversation. That means that now you have a different level of attention to these global systems and a different set of players that come in to help resolve for the problem. Because there is a problem. And the problem is not that the food system is broken, because we are feeding 8 billion people around the planet. The food system is not fit for context. We're operating on logic that was derived dating back to the 1970s.
And earlier.
Or
It's
even
Industrial
earlier. It
Revolution
depends on where
thinking.
you're at in the world. It's not leveraging all the technology. And we have all these solutions at hand. And now the logic, better data, better logic, we have to evolve the logic for how this operates. And there are many people that are seeing that around the world and saying, come on, guys, time's running out. Let's get cracking at this. Let's start implementing. And so some of the folks that have been driving and managing the farm to fork complete value chain systems have been slow-mowing this transition. I think what you're saying too, Sanah, is we're seeing in front of our eyes that we're about to not slow-mo this anymore, because the moment we get a crisis and we have this level of all hands on deck, folks are going to start asking very inconvenient questions that will force a bit of change. And so I just wanted to put that on the table, because that's an elephant in the room. It's not because we don't have solutions in the system. It's not because we can create the maps. We have the knowledge. And by the way, this is an ecosystem of change makers that is interdisciplinary, right? Look at the topics we covered in this conversation alone. We went from city planning to democracy to economic models, financial systems, all the way to the farmers and labor law. I think we're going to start seeing a lot of people convening for this topic that haven't traditionally felt like they had a stake in food, just because now we're saying, no, it's a complex topic and we need to bring these disciplines to the table.
The system is not broken, to your point. It is working exactly how it was designed to work.
Exactly. You get what you measure. Exactly that.
One of the things, Tim, we've been talking about food and health in the food world. And at the Friedman School at Tufts, I hear it said that food is a leading cause of death in this country. And in many places around the world, metabolic disease, it's
on one extreme or the other.
It's crazy. There's this whole other piece of health in the healthcare system and food, and new food as medicine movements and food as health movements. I think it's a fascinating but incredibly complicated piece of the puzzle, because at the same time, all of these systems are held a capitalist system that employs a lot of people. There's a big economy supporting a lot of people's paychecks in this system. And we're talking about radical transformation of a system that's going to, over time, transform how humans show up into the system, because the system's going to change. And there always needs to be a little bit of mindfulness around that, because you can't say, we're going to stop making soda. We're just going to stop. What would all those people do for a job? Or if we're going to stop making sugared cereal, how do you suddenly transition thousands of people that are working on that? So I think while there's an urgency, a lot of conversations happening. I walk into rooms and everyone's, let's do this now. Let's fix this now. And I'm like, but remember, we are holding massive economies here.
Totally.
Huge numbers of people, massive amounts of food flowing through systems. And when you're angry about it, it's hard to keep in mind the enormity of it, right? There's a surgical precision in this. It can't be blunt force trauma, right?
There's something.
Amen.
Yeah.
Amen.
There's something you just touched upon that I think all of us need to be hyper aware of, which is AI is about to displace a tremendous amount of jobs out there. And people are going to become disheartened, confused, angry. I just heard it yesterday. Somebody here at Hatch, their wife lost her job in marketing. And marketing, one of these industries, wiped out very quickly. So what do? Right? And I predict as this happens, we're going to need places for people to come back together. Places like Arcosanti.
This is something you taught me that I really hold dear, which is chefs are translators in the system and chefs are artists. AI can't replace that. And there are some things in this world AI can't replace the value of human creation and what it means. And a chef's role in translating and delivering and feeding love and intention, I hope that we find a way to double down. As we see the industries having challenges around AI, but also growing with AI, how do we double down on making sure that we have a pipeline of chefs who are translators?
I want to go beyond that. Even we don't need chefs. We need people who cook. To be a chef, you have to responsibility. In Cambridge, you have Dr. David Eisenberg at Harvard, who 10 years ago teamed up with the Culinary Institute of America to create this Healthy Kitchens, Healthy Lives conference. And now 10 years later, I spun out this Teaching Kitchens Collaborative to get more teaching kitchens in community. And they're springing up everywhere. If you look at restaurants right now, prices are going up, they're closing. Why? For a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons, it's hard to find cooks. You can't find people who cook out there.
For the first time ever last year, I believe, more people are now spending on food away from home than they are at food.
54% of meals are eaten outside the home. Yeah.
So what if we could use this opportunity of people coming back to the fire to hang out and cook together? Maybe we wouldn't be so lonely anymore. Maybe we'd get more than just nutritional health. Maybe we'd be healing our mental health. And maybe we'd be spending our money more locally and healing our economies at the same time. Maybe we'd be better taking care of our water resources and healing our environment.
And not just cooking, but growing together, right? And growing in systems that are much more connected. And when I think about, it's such an important point around AI and displacement, how does it impact the food systems that we're talking about? And it's very different, right? We keep going, obviously with federal government, USDA, and then I appreciate, Paola, that you're bringing the global perspective, right? And it's okay, how is this going to impact the smallholder farmers in Africa and India, which we know that's the biggest source of income and employment? That will be a different conversation than what we're having here. I keep going back to the data points, and the brand new sensitive agriculture just dropped in February, 5-year data. We continue to lose those farmers, and we now have less than 2 million farmers in the United States. We peaked in terms of our number of farmers here at 7 million back in 1935. So we're more efficient. The number of people actually growing our food is decreasing. The average age of the U.S. farmer is 60 years old. 1/3 of farmers are 65 and older. There's a mass reckoning on who is growing our food. How are we going to do it? And then young people come and they're talking about, I would love to have a market farm. I just can't get the capital. I don't know how to get my foot in the door. I don't know what to do. And I think there's a lot of interesting models happening out there too. National Farmers Coalition, mentorship between retiring farmers and newer farmers. But that is the system of who is actually going to be growing our food and mapping out where does it make sense to leverage AI and where are the places where the human element is irreplaceable and investing there.
Yeah. Can I offer to that point as well? I think that's precisely where we need to accelerate the conversion of the technology solutions that are in the system to help. Because I think folks still live up to this old-fashioned idea of what farming ought to be. And I think farming of the future will have a high degree of capability and technology that will actually make farming easier. So, for example, there's large swaths of data being made available right now. And a friend shared this data, said the last 10 years there's been more data generated through ag tech, but the farmers don't know what to do with it. And that's mainly because they're using outdated, sometimes old-fashioned practices for managing. Many of them in the U.S. are still in the U.S. Imagine what happens in the rest of the world. That doesn't have to be. There's multiple ways in which you can start upgrading. Now, some will push back and say, okay, great. Have you been on a farm? Have you done the job? And to a certain extent, yes, I've been on farms and I know more or less how they operate. I haven't done it myself day in and day out. But that doesn't mean that we can't implement some of these solutions at a more accelerated pace to help some of that conversion. And I think this mentorship of the old generation to new generation is important. And we need somebody else at that table to ensure that these new technologies are coming into place, because otherwise we're going to continue to perpetuate.
As somebody who studies food systems, innovation, food tech, I think some of the best tech is the simplest systems designed by nature. One of the things that we've decoupled is fertilizer and food systems. And we're seeing this as a huge problem right now with this potash shortage. You spoke earlier about processing animals, chickens and so forth. Chickens poop. Their poop is really good fertilizer. And we have decoupled animals from agriculture in so many ways. And we've created a vulnerability where we're dependent on outside fertilizer sources for growing our foods.
There's been a huge issue with the Russian war on Ukraine. Saw that immediately impact farmers.
Yeah, I think there's definitely indigenous, ancient ways of growing food systems, looking at the way that we've done it in the past, that we should make sure that we're incorporating into our policy. Because sometimes these chicken operations can't be grown with the lettuces, right? So we need to be able to understand, can we actually make a resilient food system, policies that support it, that we can actually be self-sufficient from these outside...
Create more circular economies, yeah.
As a future ancestor, what is a message for future generations regarding food?
There's hope.
You can't eat money. At the end of the day, stop trying to collect so much money.
Mine would be an old saying, you are what you eat.
I just hope we will have future ancestors to hear this message. But I have hope as well, especially being here at Hatch, an enormously talented and passionate group of people working at this from every single angle, including the Amazon, bringing voices that are unheard. And yeah, let's leave it with a message of hope.
Thanks, Tate.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I'm Tate Chamberlin. This is the Hatch Podcast. Sanah, Paola, Tim, Katie, thanks so much for being here. It was a pleasure.
It was a joy.
Thank you. It was awesome.
We continue the conversation, right?
Yeah. Let's go. Another 48 hours.
So here's where I landed. After all that, I don't think I'll ever look at a tomato the same way. And I mean that almost literally. The next time I'm standing in the produce aisle in February, I'm going to think about the truck and the gas and the person who grew it who never got asked what they thought. That's a small thing. It doesn't fix anything, but it's the start of the thing Kate and Tim and Paola and Sanah were all circling, which is just pay attention, notice where it came from, and ask who it was good for. Because the food system doesn't feel like a choice when you're inside it. It feels like weather. Like it just is. And what these four keep insisting, in four different ways, is that it isn't weather. Somebody built it, which means somebody, a lot of somebodies actually, can build it differently. The farm bill comes up for renewal. A school decides what's on the tray. A farmer down the road plants one more season. Or doesn't. None of it is settled. That's the hopeful part, if you want one. That's the show. Thanks for spending it with us. We'll see you next time.
It seems now more than ever that we have found ourselves on the cusp of monumental worldwide change. Whether we consider the environment, politics, infrastructure, health, economics, or inequities across a broad swath of social constructs, the consensus is clear and urgent. All is not as it should be. The United Nations, a consortium of 193 member states from around the globe, agrees. In 2015, the UN unanimously adopted the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. These goals call for urgent action in global partnership to secure peace and prosperity for people and the planet, now and into the future.
In alignment with the SDGs, Hatch, a curated network of artists, activists, and entrepreneurs working together to accelerate positive global change, has partnered with I Am Interchange to fuse adventure journalism with experiential design labs to develop innovative solutions to complex global challenges. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to the podcast. If you enjoy it, please subscribe or leave us a rating. This episode was produced by Yara Craner, Susan Karstensen, and me, Tate Chamberlin. A shout out to our media and production team, Jessica Byerly, Darko Sevilla, Jacob Desch, Sean Mackinson, Amin Yarsu, and Zane Giordano. A special thanks to Yara Craner, Jared Silverman, Kirk Euclid, Roshi Gavechi, Eitan Shapira, Pete Strom, Reem Haddad, Cole Jansen, Tom Silverman, Raymond Ansodagi, Mark Gerner, Adam Taylor, Erica Mackey, Elke Govertson, Anya Bulis, Bradley Honeyquill, and the rest of the Hatch team and crew from Arcosanti. Thank you for hosting me. To learn more about Hatch, visit hatchexperience.org. Building community could not happen without food. And with that, I'd like to thank Whistle Pig Korean, Red Tractor Pizza, and Zocalo Coffee House. Remember, share airtime and don't ruin dinner.